In this gripping story, Dr. Naomi Bennett, a successful black CEO, faces systemic racism and corruption when a routine visit to a farmer's market spirals into an unjust detainment by a prejudiced officer. What begins as racial profiling escalates into a larger conspiracy as powerful corporations work to discredit Naomi's groundbreaking medical research. The story exposes infuriating instances of racism in America, from microaggressions to blatant abuse of power, forcing Naomi to confront a system stacked against her. Her fight for justice reveals the depth of prejudice and systemic rot, making her struggle both personal and universal. The rain was coming down in steady sheets as Grace Whitaker parked her car outside the small post office in Middletown. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring at the glowing red "Open" sign flickering in the window. Inside that building was a letter she had dreaded receiving for months, yet couldn't ignore any longer. Grace was a widow, a single mother, and an elementary school teacher in her mid-30s. To her friends and neighbors, she was the embodiment of resilience. But today, sitting in her beat-up station wagon, she felt anything but strong. The letter was from Carter Industries, the chemical company her late husband had been investigating when his car mysteriously careened off the road 3 years ago. For 3 years, Grace had battled with questions no one seemed willing to answer. Why had Evan been so secretive in the weeks leading up to his death? Why had Carter Industries settled quietly with his family, without admitting fault? And most importantly, why had Evan mailed a sealed envelope to their house the night he died, an envelope that had never arrived? As she stepped out of the car, the rain soaked through her coat almost instantly, but she hardly noticed her boots splash through puddles as she hurried toward the entrance, her breath fogging in the cold night air. Inside, the warm glow of fluorescent lights did little to ease her tension. The clerk behind the counter, a young man with tired eyes and a nervous smile, handed her the envelope with a murmured, "Have a good night." Grace clutched the package like a lifeline. She didn't wait to get back to her car. She tore the envelope open right there in the post office, her hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a USB drive. The paper was a note in her husband's handwriting. "Grace, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. They'll say it was an accident, but it wasn't. You need to know the truth about Carter Industries." Her vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes, the weight of his words hitting her like a freight train. She glanced at the USB drive in her other hand, its dull plastic surface suddenly feeling heavier than anything she'd ever held. Grace knew she had a choice: walk away now, bury the letter, and drive home to her son, or open Pandora's box and confront the secrets that had cost her husband his life. Dr. Naomi Bennett tightened her grip on the steering wheel as she turned onto Main Street in Greenfield, a sleepy town nestled in the Appalachian Hills. Despite the gray, overcast sky that seemed to stretch endlessly above the rolling hills, the street bustled with activity: local vendors arranging their wares, pedestrians ambling across crosswalks, and children chasing one another on the sidewalk. The smell of rain lingered in the air, the kind that promised an imminent downpour. Naomi loved small towns like this. They reminded her of simpler times. Her grandmother's porch in Jackson, Mississippi, where Naomi had spent countless summers reading books and listening to family stories. She had grown up steeped in warmth, love, and quiet resilience, despite the world outside her grandmother's fence often being unkind. Now, at 42, Naomi was a renowned neurosurgeon and the CEO of a cutting-edge medical research firm. Her name carried weight in academic circles and boardrooms alike. Yet here she was, driving herself in her sensible sedan and dressed in casual slacks and a soft sweater, no designer logos in sight. Her colleagues often teased her about her modest lifestyle. "You're the only CEO I know who doesn't even own a private jet," they'd joke. Naomi would just smile. Wealth had never meant much to her. Impact did. She had come to Greenfield on her day off, hoping for peace and quiet. The town was a convenient detour between her clinic and her mother's home in Charleston. She had promised her mother she'd stop by for the weekend and didn't want to show up empty-handed. That's why she'd pulled over at Hillside Antiques, a charming shop she'd spotted on the corner. Its window displays were filled with vintage clocks, delicate porcelain, and hand-carved furniture. Naomi had an eye for timeless treasures and hoped to find something special. The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside, the scent of polished wood and aged paper greeting her like an old friend. The shop was cozy, cluttered with shelves overflowing with history. Naomi walked slowly, her fingers grazing the worn spines of books and the cool surface of bronze figurines. There was something calming about being surrounded by objects that had survived lifetimes. She was admiring a set of delicate crystal candlesticks when a voice broke through her quiet reverie. "Excuse me, ma'am," a woman said sharply, her tone the kind that sliced through the air. Naomi turned to see a middle-aged white woman with a tight bob and a no-nonsense demeanor standing behind the counter. Her name tag read, Margaret. "Can I help you with something?" The way she said it made it clear she didn't believe Naomi belonged there. It wasn't overt hostility, but a subtle, familiar undercurrent. Naomi recognized the look. A careful scrutiny that landed on her dark skin and casual attire, calculating how she fit, or didn't fit, into the polished setting of the shop. "No, thank you," Naomi replied, her voice calm. She turned back to the candlesticks, determined not to let the moment ruin her mood. Margaret didn't move, though she stood there, arms crossed, watching Naomi as if expecting her to make a wrong move. Naomi had encountered this too often to be surprised. In her world of hospitals and corporate meetings, the scrutiny often came dressed in polite smiles and carefully phrased questions about her qualifications. Here, it was more blunt, more exhausting. Naomi picked up one of the candlesticks, turning it over in her hands to examine the intricate etchings. She felt Margaret's eyes boring into her back and fought the urge to sigh. Moments like this were why she rarely indulged in casual outings. They were reminders that, no matter her accomplishments, she was still seen by some as someone who didn't belong. As Naomi made her way toward a display case at the back of the shop, she heard the soft scuff of shoes and realized Margaret was following her. Her patience wore thin. Taking a deep breath, Naomi set the candlestick down gently on a nearby table and turned to face the woman. "Is there a problem?" Naomi asked, her voice steady but edged with steel. Margaret hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We just like to keep an eye on things here, ma'am. Some of these items are very valuable." Naomi's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I see. Do you follow all your customers, or just the ones who look like me?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Margaret's cheeks flushed a deep red. I didn't mean anything by it," she stammered, her earlier bravado faltering. Naomi held her gaze for a moment before nodding once. "Good to know." She turned back to the display case, ignoring the way her heart thudded in her chest. Encounters like this weren't new, but they always carried a sting. The sound of the bell jingling again made Naomi glance toward the entrance. A man in a sharp gray suit walked in, his confident stride immediately commanding attention. His eyes swept the room before landing on Naomi. Recognition lit his face, and he approached her with a warm smile. "Dr. Bennett," he said, extending a hand. "What a pleasant surprise." Naomi shook his hand, her own smile polite but wary. "Mr. Caldwell," she replied. She remembered him vaguely, an executive at one of the pharmaceutical companies her firm collaborated with. What was he doing here? "I didn't expect to run into you in a place like this," Caldwell said, his tone light. "You're a hard woman to track down." Naomi chuckled softly. "I like to keep a low profile." "Well, your low profile is making waves," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "I was just in a meeting yesterday where your name came up. Your company's new research is making people nervous. You're disrupting the market in ways they didn't see coming." Naomi's smile faded. "Nervous how?" Before Caldwell could answer, Margaret's voice interrupted. "Mr. Caldwell, welcome back. Let me know if you need any assistance," she said, her earlier frostiness replaced with saccharine warmth. Naomi's jaw tightened as she watched Margaret all but fawn over Caldwell. The contrast wasn't lost on her. Caldwell glanced between the two women, his brow furrowing slightly as he seemed to piece together what had just occurred. "Thank you, Margaret," he said, his tone cool. Turning back to Naomi, he added, "I'd love to discuss this more, but perhaps over coffee sometime. I won't take up more of your afternoon." Naomi nodded. "That sounds fine. Have your office set it up." As Caldwell walked away, Naomi felt a familiar heaviness settle in her chest. She had spent her life navigating spaces that weren't designed for people like her. Even now, at the height of her career, The weight of proving herself never seemed to lift. Margaret, avoiding Naomi's gaze, retreated to the counter. Naomi glanced at the candlesticks one last time, then turned and walked out of the shop, the bell jingling softly behind her. The rain had started again, a steady rhythm against the pavement. Naomi sat in her car for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel. She had come here for a quiet escape, but instead, she'd been reminded of the quiet battles she fought every day. She took a deep breath, the damp air fogging up the windows slightly. Tomorrow, she would go back to her office, back to the research that was unsettling the pharmaceutical giants. She would fight on a different battlefield, one where the stakes were higher, but the rules were clearer. But for now, she let herself sit in the stillness, her reflection staring back at her in the rain-streaked window. Naomi tightened her grip on the steering wheel as she pulled out of the parking lot of Hillside Antiques, the soft patter of rain blending with the rhythmic swish of her windshield wipers. The encounter with Margaret had left a bitter taste in her mouth, but she refused to let it derail her day. She had more pressing concerns, like deciphering what Caldwell meant about her work, making people nervous. The road curved sharply as Naomi navigated toward the outskirts of Greenfield. She had planned to make a quick stop at the local farmer's market before heading to her mother's home. It was one of those places she adored. Vibrant stalls brimming with fresh produce, local crafts, and an air of quiet camaraderie. For a moment, she hoped the market would offer the reprieve she needed. Parking along the gravel shoulder, Naomi stepped out into the drizzle, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. The market stretched out ahead, rows of colorful tarps fluttering in the wind. The scent of wet earth mingled with freshly baked bread and ripe fruit. Naomi let herself relax, blending into the crowd as she strolled between stalls, her mind wandering to the research projects awaiting her attention back at the office. She paused at a booth offering jars of homemade preserves, picking up a small jar of peach jam. As she moved to pay, the elderly vendor smiled warmly. "You visiting from out of town?" he asked. "Yes, just passing through," Naomi replied. Returning the smile, she handed him cash and slipped the jar into her bag, feeling a flicker of gratitude for the brief, uncomplicated exchange. But her sense of ease didn't last. As she rounded the corner toward a stall selling handmade pottery, she heard raised voices nearby. A man and a woman were arguing, their words sharp and cutting through the soft murmur of the market. Naomi glanced over to see a vendor gesturing animatedly at two young black teenagers standing by his stall. "You're not touching anything else until you pay for what's in your bag," the man snapped, his face red with anger. One of the boys, no older than 15, held up his hands in protest. "We didn't take anything," the boy said, his voice trembling. "We were just looking." The vendor cut him off. "Don't lie to me, I've seen your kind before, always sneaking around like you're up to something. Show me your bag, or I'll call the police." Naomi felt her stomach twist as she watched the scene unfold. The market had grown quiet, people stopping to stare, but not stepping in. She recognized the look on the vendor's face, one of suspicion that had nothing to do with anything tangible, and everything to do with the boy's skin color. Naomi hesitated, weighing whether to intervene. She had learned over the years to pick her battles carefully, knowing that standing up in these moments often came with consequences. But as she saw the fear in the boy's eyes, a pang of familiarity hit her. She'd been in their shoes once, long before she was a surgeon or a CEO, when she was just a young girl, learning that the world didn't always see her for who she was. "Excuse me," Naomi said, stepping forward. Her voice was calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. The vendor turned to her, his expression flickering with surprise. "They didn't take anything," she continued. "I've been watching them since they got here. They were just browsing." The vendor's gaze hardened. "And who are you, their lawyer?" "No," Naomi replied, meeting his glare without flinching. "But I do know that accusing someone without proof is a dangerous thing." For a moment, the man faltered, his bravado wavering under the weight of her words, but he quickly recovered, gesturing toward the teenagers. "If they've got nothing to hide, they can show me their bags." "They don't have to," Naomi said sharply. "Not without evidence, and certainly not just because you feel suspicious, you don't have the right." The crowd murmured, the tension thick in the air. The vendor opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, a uniformed police officer appeared, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his tone brisk. His badge gleamed under the market lights, and his hand rested casually on his belt. Naomi's chest tightened as she recognized the now familiar shift in power. The vendor wasted no time pointing at the boys. "These two have been acting suspicious. I think they've stolen something." The officer turned his gaze to the teenagers, who looked frozen in place. He took a step closer, his voice calm but authoritative. "All right, let's see your bags." Naomi stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Officer, they haven't done anything wrong. This man has no evidence, just assumptions." The officer looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, we need to make sure everything's above board. If they haven't taken anything, there's nothing to worry about." "And if they have," Naomi said, her voice rising slightly, "then what? What message are you sending when you single out kids based on a hunch? Are you going to search everyone here, or just them?" The officer's jaw tightened, and Naomi could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze on her. She knew the risk she was taking. Standing up like this could easily backfire. But the alternative, staying silent, felt worse. "Ma'am," the officer said finally, his tone clipped, "I suggest you let me do my job." "And I suggest you do it without perpetuating stereotypes," Naomi shot back. "You have a choice right now. You can escalate this, or you can de-escalate and show these boys the respect they deserve." The officer hesitated, his eyes flicking between Naomi and the teenagers. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. Finally, he sighed and turned back to the vendor. "Do you have proof that something was taken?" he asked. The vendor stammered, clearly unprepared for the question. I just thought." "That's not proof," the officer said, his voice firm now. "Unless you've got something solid, there's nothing more I can do here." The vendor's face flushed red as he realized he'd lost the argument. Naomi felt a flicker of relief as the officer turned to the boys. "You're free to go," he said, his tone softer. The boys didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed their bags and hurried away, throwing Naomi a grateful glance as they disappeared into the crowd. Naomi watched them go, her heart still racing. The officer gave her a lingering look before walking off, his posture stiff. The vendor muttered something under his breath and turned back to his stall, refusing to meet Naomi's eyes. As the crowd dispersed, Naomi let out a slow breath. She knew she had done the right thing, but the familiar heaviness settled over her again. It wasn't just about the vendor, or the officer, it was about a system that allowed moments like this to happen over and over again. "Ma'am," a voice said behind her. She turned to see an older woman, her face lined with age and worry. "That was brave of you." Naomi forced a small smile. "It shouldn't have to be brave," she replied. "It should just be normal." The woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe one day it will be, but not without people like you." Naomi thanked her quietly and turned back toward her car. The drizzle had turned into a steady rain, and she welcomed the cool drops on her face. As she slid into the driver's seat, she stared out at the market, her reflection ghost-like in the window. The fight wasn't new, and it wasn't over. But Naomi knew she couldn't stop. Not now, not ever. The drive back to the main road was quiet. The only sounds the rain drumming against Naomi's windshield and the rhythmic whoosh of her wipers. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, but she ignored it. She needed time to decompress. The incident at the farmer's market gnawed at her, not just because of the blatant prejudice, but because of how easily it could have spiraled further out of control. The boys could have been detained, or worse, had she not stepped in. The road narrowed as Naomi drove past a stretch of thick woods. She checked her rearview mirror and noticed a set of headlights closing in fast behind her. The vehicle seemed out of place on this isolated stretch, its high beams glaring in her mirrors. Unease crept into her chest as the car tailgated her, staying uncomfortably close despite the wide-open road ahead. She slowed, signaling for the driver to pass, but the car didn't move. Instead, it flashed its blue and red lights. Naomi's stomach dropped. It was a police car. She pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The officer's vehicle stopped a few feet behind hers, its lights strobing in the gloom. Naomi lowered her window slightly, letting in the damp air as she retrieved her ID and insurance card from the glove compartment. The officer approached, a tall man with a stern expression. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat as he leaned down to peer through her window. "License and registration," he said curtly. Naomi handed him the documents, keeping her voice calm. "Is there a reason I'm being stopped, officer?" "You failed to signal when you merged back onto the road," he replied, though Naomi was certain she had his tone carried the same undercurrent of suspicion she had heard earlier at the market. Naomi nodded. "Understood." The officer scanned her license, his eyes narrowing slightly when he read her name. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his tone shifting just enough to suggest he recognized her. Whether that recognition would work in her favor or against her, she couldn't yet tell. He straightened, stepping back toward his cruiser without further explanation. Naomi sat in her car, the rain continuing to pound against the roof, her heart thudding in her chest. Something felt off. She glanced in her rearview mirror and noticed the officer wasn't running her information, but instead speaking into his radio, his gaze flicking toward her car every few seconds. Moments later, another cruiser arrived, its lights slicing through the rain. A second officer, a stocky man with a gruff demeanor, joined the first. They exchanged a few words before both approached Naomi's car. The lead officer gestured for her to step out. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to exit the vehicle," he said. Naomi's pulse quickened. "May I ask why?" The second officer's expression hardened. "Step out of the car, ma'am." Realizing she had little choice, Naomi unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out, the cold rain soaking her immediately. She kept her hands visible, aware of the precariousness of the situation. The lead officer glanced at his partner before speaking again. "We've received reports of a vehicle matching this description involved in suspicious activity near the farmer's market." Naomi's jaw tightened. She knew exactly what this was. A pretext, flimsy and baseless. The vendor from the market must have made a call, spinning a story that now had her standing in the rain, under the scrutiny of two officers. "That's not possible," Naomi said evenly. "I was at the market, but I didn't." "We'll need to check your vehicle," the second officer interrupted. "Just a routine inspection." Naomi hesitated, her instinct screaming that this wasn't routine at all, but resisting could escalate things dangerously. She stepped aside, nodding toward her car. "Go ahead." The officers searched her car thoroughly, rifling through the trunk and glove compartment as Naomi stood by the roadside, her hands trembling from the cold and the rising tension. When they found nothing, their frustration became evident. "Look," the lead officer said, stepping closer. "We've got a job to do. If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind answering a few questions down at the station." Naomi froze. "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet," the second officer said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. This was a test, Naomi realized. They wanted to see how far they could push her, how much she would bend before breaking. Her mind raced. She had done nothing wrong, but refusing their request could be twisted into non-compliance. Taking a deep breath, she looked the lead officer in the eye. "I'll answer your questions, but I'd like to contact my attorney first." The officers exchanged a glance. It was clear they hadn't expected her to assert herself so calmly. "You can call your lawyer from the station," the lead officer said finally, motioning toward his cruiser. Naomi's stomach churned as she climbed into the back seat of the police car, the doors locking behind her with a heavy click. The humiliation was sharp and immediate, but she forced herself to stay composed. She had faced worse battles in sterile operating rooms and unforgiving boardrooms. This was just another fight, one she would win by staying sharp and refusing to let fear take over. At the station, Naomi was seated in a stark, fluorescent-lit room, her damp coat clinging to her shoulders. The officers had taken her phone, leaving her without a way to contact anyone. She stared at the one-way mirror on the wall, her reflection staring back at her with calm resolve, despite the storm brewing inside her. The door opened, and the lead officer entered, a file in hand. He sat across from her, his demeanor professional but clipped. "Dr. Bennett," he began, "we have reason to believe you may have been involved in a disturbance earlier today." Naomi leaned forward slightly. "What exactly am I being accused of?" The officer didn't answer directly. "We've had reports of theft and disruptive behavior at the market. Witnesses described a woman matching your description." Naomi suppressed a bitter laugh. "Matching my description," she repeated. "That's interesting, considering the only disturbance I saw was a vendor accusing two boys of stealing without evidence." The officer's expression didn't change. "We'll sort all that out. For now, We just need your cooperation. And I'm cooperating, Naomi said evenly. But I also know my rights. Unless you have evidence linking me to a crime, I'm free to leave. Her words hung in the air, the tension between them palpable. The officer stared at her, his jaw tightening. Before he could respond, the door opened again, and another figure stepped in. A man in a suit with a badge clipped to his belt. Dr. Bennett? The newcomer said, his tone smooth but authoritative. I'm Detective Harris. I'd like to have a word. Naomi nodded. Her guard up Harris dismissed the lead officer with a wave, then took the seat across from her. I apologize for the inconvenience, he began, his tone friendlier than she expected. I've reviewed the situation, and it seems there's been a misunderstanding. Naomi raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding? Harris sighed, leaning forward. The vendor at the market made a call. He claimed you interfered in his business. The officers responding may have overstepped. Naomi's chest tightened with anger. Overstepped? They detained me based on nothing. Harris nodded, his expression almost sympathetic. You're right, and I'll make sure this is cleared up immediately. You'll be free to go. Naomi didn't move. And the officers? What happens to them? Harris hesitated. I'll be reviewing their conduct. But you know how these things go. Naomi's gaze hardened. Yes, I do. Harris stood, gesturing toward the door. Let me escort you out again. My apologies for the inconvenience. As she followed him down the corridor, Naomi's mind raced. She had no doubt that if she hadn't been who she was, if her name and credentials hadn't carried weight, this situation could have ended very differently. The thought was both infuriating and sobering. Outside the station, the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and damp. Naomi retrieved her phone and called her attorney, detailing everything that had happened. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As she drove away, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, a new resolve settled over her. She had spent years fighting systemic injustice in healthcare. Maybe it was time to expand that fight to other arenas. Naomi's phone buzzed relentlessly as she drove away from the station, her attorney's name flashing on the screen. She didn't answer, her mind racing as she replayed every humiliating moment of the day. The market vendor's baseless accusations, the officer's unwarranted search, the veiled dismissal from Detective Harris, it all formed a vivid mosaic of systemic rot. It wasn't the first time Naomi had been reminded that her success didn't shield her from prejudice, but this felt different, more personal, and more dangerous. By the time she reached her mother's home in Charleston, night had fallen. The stately White House, with its wraparound porch and hydrangeas blooming along the walkway, looked as inviting as ever. Naomi sat in the car for a moment, trying to calm her nerves. She couldn't let this ruin the weekend she had promised her mother. But even as she stepped out of the car and felt the warm glow of porch light on her face, the tension in her chest refused to ease. Naomi, her mother called from the doorway, her voice bright with joy. You made it! Naomi forced a smile. Of course, Mom. You know I wouldn't miss this. Her mother, Evelyn Bennett, was a retired schoolteacher with a presence that commanded respect. At 72, her sharp mind and fiery spirit were as strong as ever. She hugged Naomi tightly, then pulled back to study her face. You look tired, Evelyn said, her brow furrowing. What happened? Naomi hesitated. She had planned to keep the day's events to herself, but the weight of them was too much to carry alone. It's been a long day, she admitted. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Come inside, let's talk. Sitting at the kitchen table, Naomi recounted everything that had happened, from the farmer's market to the station. Evelyn listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to anger. They had no right, Evelyn said firmly when Naomi finished. And you can't let this slide. I know, Naomi said, rubbing her temples. But what am I supposed to do? File a complaint? We both know that won't change anything. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice steady and determined. You have a platform, Naomi. People listen to you. If you don't stand up and shine a light on this, who will? Naomi looked at her mother, the words striking a chord deep within her. Evelyn had always been a fighter, standing up against segregation in her youth and advocating for education reform throughout her career. She was right. Of course, staying silent wasn't an option. I'll think about it, Naomi said finally. But even as she spoke, an idea was beginning to take shape. The next morning, Naomi sat on the porch with her coffee, scrolling through the news on her tablet. The headlines were as disheartening as ever: stories of racial bias, police misconduct, and corporate greed. But one headline caught her attention: local CEO leads groundbreaking healthcare initiative. The article was about her company's latest project, a revolutionary treatment for traumatic brain injuries. Naomi's face stared back at her from the page, her name a beacon of hope for patients and families. For a moment, pride swelled in her chest. But then she remembered Caldwell's cryptic words at the antique shop. "You're making people nervous." Her mind turned back to the day before, the vendor's call. The officer's overly aggressive response, Harris's dismissive apology. Could it all be connected? It seemed far-fetched, but the timing was suspicious. Naomi opened her email and drafted a message to her attorney, outlining her suspicions. She needed answers about the vendor's call, about the officers, and about Caldwell's comment. If there was a pattern, she would find it. By afternoon, Naomi had received a response from her attorney, Mitchell Ross, a longtime ally and trusted advisor. His email was brief but concerning. "Dr. Bennett, I've reached out to some contacts, and I'm hearing whispers about a coordinated effort to discredit you. It's not just the market incident, there's talk of an investigation into your company. We need to meet immediately." Naomi's chest tightened as she read the words. An investigation into her company. She couldn't imagine what grounds they had. Her team operated with the highest ethical standards, and she had always been meticulous about compliance, but if someone was targeting her, they didn't need a valid reason, just the appearance of one. She called Mitchell, her voice low and tense. "What do you know?" Mitchell sighed. "Not much yet, but I have a strong hunch that someone in the pharmaceutical world is behind this. Your research is disrupting their profits, and they don't like it." Naomi clenched her jaw. "So, what do we do?" "I'm working on getting more details," Mitchell said. "In the meantime, you need to be careful, watch what you say and do, and keep a record of everything." Naomi hung up, her resolve hardening. This was bigger than her. If someone was trying to silence her, it was because her work was threatening the status quo, and that meant she was on the right track. Later that evening, Naomi received an unexpected call from Detective Harris. She hesitated before answering, unsure of what he wanted. "Dr. Bennett," Harris said, his tone more guarded than before, "I thought you'd want to know. The vendor from the market filed a formal complaint against you." Naomi's stomach turned. "On what grounds?" "He claims you interfered with his business and caused a disturbance," Harris said. "It's baseless, but it's on record now. Just a heads up." Naomi took a deep breath, her mind racing. This wasn't random. The complaint was another piece of the puzzle, a deliberate attempt to tarnish her reputation. "Thank you for letting me know," she said evenly. "I'll handle it." After hanging up, Naomi stared at her phone, her thoughts churning. It was clear now. Someone was orchestrating a campaign against her. The question was how far they were willing to go, and how she could fight back. The next morning, Naomi held a meeting with her leadership team via video conference. She outlined the situation, omitting the more personal details, but making it clear that their work was under scrutiny. "We need to be flawless," she said, her tone firm. "Every document, every protocol. If they're looking for a reason to undermine us, they won't find one." Her team nodded, their expressions serious. They understood the stakes. Naomi felt a surge of gratitude for their loyalty, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her team, her patients, and the integrity of their work. As the week progressed, the tension continued to build. The market complaint gained traction in local media, framing Naomi as a disruptive outsider. Anonymous sources began leaking rumors about her company, questioning its practices, and then came the subpoena, a formal notice that her company was under federal investigation for alleged financial improprieties. Naomi stared at the document in disbelief. It was the tipping point, a clear escalation in the campaign against her. She knew she had two choices: retreat quietly and let the narrative unfold, or go on the offensive. Her decision was immediate. She wouldn't back down. Naomi called Mitchell, her voice steady despite the storm raging around her. "We're going public," she said. I'm not letting them destroy everything we've built without a fight. Mitchell hesitated. Are you sure this could get ugly? I'm sure, Naomi said. They want to play dirty fine. But I'm not playing their game, I'm bringing this into the light. As she hung up, Naomi felt a rush of determination. This wasn't just about clearing her name, it was about exposing the forces that sought to suppress progress for the sake of profit. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was her resolve. She opened her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys as she drafted a statement. It was time to take control of the narrative, and to fight back with everything she had. Naomi stood on the steps of the Charleston Civic Center, her breath steady despite the whirlwind around her. News vans lined the street. Their cameras aimed at the building's grand entrance. Reporters and onlookers buzzed with anticipation, waiting for the press conference she had called that morning. Naomi adjusted the lapel of her blazer, her face calm, but her mind racing. This was it. Her stand. The subpoena had been the final straw. Every move over the past week, from the baseless complaint at the market to the smear campaign in the media, had been calculated to undermine her. Now, the federal investigation was the crescendo, designed to cripple her company and tarnish her name. She wasn't naive enough to believe this was coincidental. Someone powerful wanted her silenced, and they were playing for keeps. Mitchell stood beside her, his face grim. You ready for this? I don't have a choice, Naomi said. She smoothed her notes, though she knew them by heart. We either fight back or let them destroy us. Mitchell nodded. Just remember to stay composed, they'll twist anything they can. Naomi gave him a sharp look. They've already twisted everything. Before Mitchell could respond, the Civic Center doors opened, and a flood of noise greeted them as they stepped into the bright afternoon sun. Camera flashes flickered like lightning. Naomi strode to the podium, her heels clicking with confidence. She faced the crowd, her heart pounding, but her expression unflinching. Good afternoon, she began, her voice firm and clear. I'm Dr. Naomi Bennett, CEO of Bennett Neurological Innovations. Over the past week, I have been the target of a coordinated campaign designed to discredit me and dismantle my work. Today, I'm here to set the record straight. The crowd hushed. Every lens and microphone focused on her. For years, my team and I have worked tirelessly to revolutionize the treatment of traumatic brain injuries. Our latest research has the potential to save countless lives and disrupt an industry that has long prioritized profit over progress. Unfortunately, this disruption has made us a target. Naomi paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. What began as baseless accusations against my character has escalated into an unwarranted federal investigation into my company. Let me be clear. These allegations are false. My team operates with the highest ethical standards, and I welcome any scrutiny into our practices, but I will not stand by while lies are used to undermine our mission. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her tone sharpening. I know who's behind this, and I have the receipts. The buzz intensified as Naomi reached into her bag and held up a thick envelope. Contained in this folder are documents, emails, and internal memos that expose a coordinated effort by several major pharmaceutical companies to discredit my work. They are afraid of what we're building, because it threatens their bottom line. She placed the folder on the podium. I've provided copies to my legal team and to investigative journalists. The truth will come out, and those responsible will be held accountable. A hand shot up in the crowd. Dr. Bennett, can you name these companies? A reporter called. Naomi's lips curved into a grim smile. You'll find their names in the documents, but I will say this. These companies thrive on maintaining the status quo. They profit from outdated treatments while patients suffer. My work threatens that, and they'll do anything to stop it. As the questions poured in, a commotion at the edge of the crowd drew everyone's attention. Naomi's heart sank as she saw two uniformed officers pushing through the throng. One of them, a familiar face, was Officer Daniels, the man who had detained her at the market. His expression was smug, his posture radiating authority as he approached the podium. Dr. Bennett, Daniels said, his voice loud enough to silence the crowd, I have a warrant for your arrest. The words hit like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the onlookers as cameras swiveled to capture the moment. Naomi's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground, meeting Daniel's gaze with steely defiance. For what? She demanded, her voice steady. Daniels smirked, holding up a document. Obstruction of justice. You interfered in an active investigation last week at the farmers market, and we have witnesses to prove it. The crowd erupted into chaos, reporters shouting questions, spectators murmuring in disbelief. Naomi took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. This is a farce, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. You're using this as a distraction, and everyone here knows it. Daniels stepped closer, his hand resting on his holstered cuffs. You're welcome to explain yourself down at the station, Dr. Bennett. Mitchell moved between them, his tone cold. Officer, you're making a mistake. This is a blatant abuse of power, and you'll answer for it. Daniels shrugged, clearly unfazed. I'm just following orders. Naomi's eyes narrowed. Whose orders? Daniels hesitated, just long enough for her to see the flicker of doubt in his expression, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. That's enough. The crowd parted as Detective Harris approached, his face unreadable. He held up a hand, stopping Daniels in his tracks. This arrest isn't happening. Daniels turned on him, incredulous. But the warrant was improperly issued, Harris said, his tone sharp. He looked at Naomi, his gaze steady. Dr. Bennett, I believe you've made your point. If you'll allow me, I'd like to review the documents you've presented. We need to ensure everything is handled properly. Naomi studied him, searching for any hint of deception, but Harris seemed genuine, his expression firm but not hostile. Fine, she said finally. But make no mistake, I'm not backing down. Harris nodded, gesturing for Daniels to back off. The officer reluctantly stepped aside, his jaw tight with frustration. As Harris escorted her into the Civic Center, Naomi felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. The confrontation had been public, messy, and humiliating. But it had also been necessary. She had forced the system to show its hand, exposing the corruption that sought to silence her. Inside, Harris stopped and turned to face her. Dr. Bennett, I know you don't trust me, but if what you're saying is true, you'll need allies. Let me help. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Why the sudden change of heart? Harris hesitated, then sighed. Because I've seen what happens when people like Daniels get away with this, and I'm tired of being part of the problem. Naomi studied him, her instincts screaming caution. But for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this fight wasn't hers alone. Then start by holding him accountable, she said, her voice firm. And make sure those companies don't get away with this. Harris nodded. You have my word. As she left the Civic Center, the crowd outside erupted into questions and cheers. Naomi held her head high, her resolve unshaken. This was only the beginning, but she was ready for whatever came next. Naomi sat in the front row of the packed courtroom, her composure as calm and impenetrable as the polished wood of the bench ahead of her. The air was thick with anticipation, the murmurs of the assembled crowd reverberating against the high ceilings. This wasn't where she had expected to be today, but the stakes had risen beyond her control. Today was about more than defending herself. It was about exposing the rot that had tried to swallow her whole. Across the aisle, Officer Daniels sat with his lawyer, his expression smug as he leaned back in his chair. His confidence sent a sharp jolt of anger through Naomi's chest. He had been emboldened, not just by the warrant fiasco, but by the system that had always shielded him to Daniels. This wasn't a trial, it was a game, but Naomi wasn't here to play. The judge, an older man with silver hair and an air of stern efficiency, entered the room and called for order. As everyone stood and then sat, Naomi glanced at Mitchell, her attorney, who gave her a small nod of reassurance. The case was a hearing on procedural misconduct. With Daniels as the focus, Naomi had filed a formal complaint, armed with evidence of Daniels' overreach at the market and the fraudulent warrant for her arrest. The room wasn't just filled with legal professionals, it was packed with media, activists, and members of the public who had caught wind of her story. The eyes of the room bore down on Naomi, expecting her to deliver. As the proceedings began, the prosecutor laid out a damning case against Daniels, citing his blatant abuse of power and his role in the broader campaign against Naomi. Emails had surfaced, thanks to Naomi's earlier press conference, that linked Daniels to representatives from a major pharmaceutical company. The emails showed coordinated discussions about Naomi's work, including directives to keep her in check. Naomi's stomach churned as the emails were read aloud. She had suspected the connection, but hearing it confirmed made the betrayal sting. Even more, Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat for the first time, his smug demeanor cracking. Then came the moment Naomi had been waiting for. The opportunity to testify. She rose from her seat, every eye in the room following her as she approached the witness stand. As she was sworn in, her heart pounded, but her resolve hardened. This was her moment to face Daniels directly and expose him for who he was. Mitchell began the questioning, his voice calm and measured. "Dr. Bennett, can you describe the events leading to Officer Daniels issuing a warrant for your arrest?" Naomi recounted the incident at the farmer's market, her tone steady. Despite the emotion bubbling beneath the surface, she described the vendor's baseless accusations, Daniels' aggressive behavior, and the humiliation of being detained without cause. She didn't shy away from the details, painting a vivid picture of how Daniels had escalated the situation unnecessarily. When she finished, Mitchell stepped back, his gaze sharp. "Dr. Bennett, in your experience, do you believe Officer Daniels' actions were motivated by legitimate concerns, or by something else?" Naomi met Daniels' gaze, her voice unwavering. "His actions were motivated by prejudice and a desire to silence me. He wasn't enforcing the law, he was enforcing bias." The courtroom murmured, the weight of her words settling over the crowd like a heavy fog. Daniels' lawyer objected, but the judge allowed her statement to stand. Then it was Daniels' turn to take the stand. He swaggered to the front of the room, his earlier discomfort replaced with a defensive bravado. His lawyer guided him through a rehearsed narrative, painting him as an officer just doing his job, acting on credible complaints. But the cracks in his story became evident under cross-examination. Mitchell stepped forward, his question sharp and unrelenting. "Officer Daniels, are you aware of the emails linking you to pharmaceutical representatives discussing Dr. Bennett's work?" Daniels hesitated, his face tightening. "I don't recall those emails." Mitchell smirked. "You don't recall? Let me refresh your memory." He handed a document to the judge and read aloud. "We can't afford to let her disrupt the market. Use whatever tools you have to keep her occupied." "Does that jog your memory?" Daniel's face flushed, but he tried to maintain his composure. I was following up on a report from the market. It had nothing to do with her work." Mitchell stepped closer. "So you're saying it's a coincidence that you targeted Dr. Bennett, issued a fraudulent warrant, and attempted to arrest her, all while receiving communications from individuals with a vested interest in silencing her?" Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched, oppressive and damning. Mitchell delivered the final blow. "Officer Daniels, isn't it true that you've previously been reprimanded for racially biased policing?" Daniels froze, his confidence crumbling. The prosecutor submitted records of Daniels' disciplinary history, multiple complaints from black residents who had accused him of profiling and harassment. Daniels' lawyer scrambled to object, but the damage was done. The courtroom was electric with tension, the tide turning decisively against Daniels. When the questioning ended, Daniels slumped back into his chair, his earlier bravado shattered. The evidence was clear. He wasn't just a corrupt officer, he was a willing pawn in a larger scheme. The judge called for a brief recess, allowing the room to settle. Naomi stepped outside to the courthouse steps, where the air was crisp and the crowd of supporters and journalists awaited. "Dr. Bennett!" a reporter called, thrusting a microphone toward her. "How do you feel after today's revelations?" Naomi took a deep breath. "This isn't about how I feel," she said, her voice steady. "This is about holding people accountable, not just individuals like Officer Daniels, but the systems that allow this kind of corruption to flourish. I won't stop fighting until we see real change." The crowd erupted in cheers, their support fueling her resolve. But even as she spoke, Naomi knew the battle was far from over. Daniels' exposure was just the beginning. The pharmaceutical companies that had orchestrated this campaign against her were still lurking in the shadows, their influence far-reaching and insidious. As Naomi returned to the courtroom, the final moments of the hearing played out. The judge condemned Daniels' actions as egregious misconduct and announced that a formal investigation into the pharmaceutical company's involvement would follow. It was a victory, but a precarious one. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, Naomi felt a surge of both relief and uncertainty. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Outside the courthouse, as the crowd began to disperse, Mitchell pulled her aside. "This isn't over, Naomi," he said quietly. "The companies behind this won't go down without a fight." Naomi nodded, her jaw set. "Then we'll fight harder." Her words carried the weight of conviction. She had faced the system's worst and come out stronger. Now, it was time to dismantle it. Piece by piece. The courtroom's silence was deafening as the judge's gavel struck one last time, finalizing the ruling officer Daniel's dismissal from the force was official, his actions deemed a violation of ethical and procedural standards. More significantly, the court ordered a full-scale investigation into the pharmaceutical companies implicated in the campaign against Naomi, fueled by the incriminating emails and testimonies revealed during the hearing. For Naomi, it was a victory, but a complex one. Daniels was a single cog in a much larger machine, and the systemic forces she was up against remained formidable. Still, as she walked out of the courthouse to a crowd of supporters and journalists, she felt a flicker of hope. The tide was turning. The aftermath of the trial rippled through Greenfield and beyond. News outlets seized on the story of corruption and bias, and the pharmaceutical companies named in the evidence scrambled to contain the fallout. Executives resigned, PR teams launched damage control campaigns, and public trust in the industry took a significant hit. Daniels, stripped of his badge and exposed for his role in the scheme, attempted to save face with a carefully crafted apology to the media. But his words rang hollow against the weight of the evidence. He became a symbol of systemic corruption. One man caught in a web of prejudice and greed. Detective Harris, meanwhile, took a different path. Emboldened by Naomi's stand and the weight of his own conscience, he publicly supported the investigation. His decision alienated some of his colleagues, but earned him respect from others, as well as the broader community. He vowed to work toward reform from within the system, a commitment that, while imperfect, represented a glimmer of hope. For Naomi, the journey had been both humbling and transformative. As she stood before the crowd of supporters gathered outside the courthouse, she reflected on how far she had come, not just in this battle, but in her life. "I want to thank everyone who stood by me," Naomi said, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "This victory isn't just mine, it belongs to every person who's been silenced, every community that's been marginalized, and every advocate who's fought for justice." She paused, letting her words settle. "This isn't the end, it's the beginning. We've exposed one piece of a broken system, but there's so much more work to do. I promise to keep fighting. Not just for myself, but for all of us." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers carrying a resonance that felt both cathartic and galvanizing. Naomi felt a swell of gratitude and resolve. She had been tested in ways she never imagined. And though the scars of the ordeal would remain, they had strengthened her. The trial sparked a wave of activism and scrutiny, not just in Greenfield, but nationally. Civil rights organizations used the case as a rallying cry, demanding greater accountability in law enforcement and corporate governance. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at curbing the influence of pharmaceutical companies over public institutions, and grassroots movements pushed for reforms in policing. Naomi's company, Bennett Neurological Innovations, became a symbol of integrity and perseverance. Donations poured in, and new partnerships formed with organizations that shared her mission of ethical, life-saving innovation. The company's work continued, unimpeded by the smear campaign that had sought to dismantle it. Naomi herself became an advocate beyond the medical field, lending her voice to causes she had long supported, but never had the platform to champion so publicly. She was invited to speak at universities, community centers, and conferences, where she shared her story and urged others to stand against injustice. Despite the victories, there were quiet moments when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm Naomi. Late at night, alone in her office or at home, she would replay the events in her mind, the humiliation, the fear, the anger. But she also remembered the faces of the boys at the farmer's market, the ones she had stood up for. She thought of her mother, whose unwavering belief in her had been a source of strength. She thought of the crowd outside the courthouse, their chants of support carrying her forward. One evening, as she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, Evelyn joined her. The two women sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fireflies dance in the warm summer air. "You've done good, Naomi," Evelyn said finally, her voice filled with pride. "You've shown them what it means to stand tall." Naomi smiled, her heart swelling. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom." Evelyn chuckled softly. "Oh, I know that, but don't think for a second you're done. There's still a lot of work to do." Naomi nodded, the weight of her mother's words sinking in. "I know, and I'm ready for it." As the dust settled, Naomi began to plan her next steps. She knew the pharmaceutical companies wouldn't go down quietly, and the investigation into their practices would be long and grueling. She also knew there were others like Daniels, officers, executives, politicians, who would resist change at every turn. But she also saw the cracks forming in the system, the light beginning to shine through. She had allies now: Mitchell, Harris, her team at Bennett Neurological Innovations, and the countless supporters who had rallied behind her. Together, they had momentum, and Naomi was determined to use it. A week after the trial, Naomi received an invitation to speak at a national summit on systemic injustice. She accepted, knowing it was an opportunity to amplify her voice and inspire others to join the fight. As she packed her bags for the trip, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was her path, difficult, uncertain, but necessary. Before leaving, she stopped by the farmer's market where everything had begun. The vendor who had falsely accused the boys was gone, his stall replaced by one run by a local nonprofit. Naomi bought a jar of peach jam and smiled as she left, the weight of the past week lifting ever so slightly. As she drove away, the horizon stretched before her, wide and full of possibility. As Naomi Bennett looked out over the crowded hall at the national summit, she took a moment to center herself. The applause that had greeted her minutes earlier was still echoing faintly, a testament to the room's energy. Attendees from all walks of life, activists, community leaders, students, and professionals, had gathered to hear her speak. It was an opportunity she hadn't sought but now embraced fully, understanding that her journey had brought her here for a reason. Naomi stood at the podium, her speech notes in hand, though she had no intention of reading them word for word. Instead, she spoke from her heart. "When I first started this journey, I thought my role was simple: innovate in medicine, improve lives, and let my work speak for itself. I didn't set out to become an activist or a public figure. But life has a way of showing us paths we don't expect, and often don't feel ready for." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "I didn't feel ready when I was stopped at that farmer's market for no reason other than the color of my skin. I didn't feel ready when I was unjustly detained and humiliated. And I certainly didn't feel ready when I learned that powerful corporations were orchestrating a campaign to silence me." The room was silent, the weight of her words palpable. "But here's what I've learned," she continued. "You don't need to feel ready to do what's right. You just need to stand up, because every step forward matters. Every challenge we confront, every truth we expose, brings us closer to the justice we all deserve." The events of the past months had reshaped Naomi in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had always been driven and resilient, but this experience had deepened her understanding of what those qualities truly meant. It wasn't just about pushing through adversity, it was about using her position, her voice, and her privilege to shine a light on issues far bigger than herself. Naomi had always known that systemic problems like racism and corruption required systemic solutions. But now she understood how personal those battles could feel, and how much strength it took to confront them head-on. Through the support of her team, her family, and her community, she had learned the power of collective action and the importance of allies, even within flawed systems. Her relationship with Detective Harris was one such lesson. Initially a skeptic and a product of the system she fought against, Harris had chosen to step up when it mattered. His transformation reminded Naomi that change could come from unexpected places, and that even those entrenched in flawed systems could become part of the solution. Now, Naomi was committed to doing more than just surviving injustice. She was determined to dismantle it. One step at a time, Naomi's story was just one thread in a much larger tapestry. A single case that revealed the depth of systemic issues plaguing society. From the farmer's market to the courthouse, the events she endured mirrored the experiences of countless others. Those who had faced profiling, discrimination, and the weight of institutionalized bias without the platform or resources to fight back. Her case had shed light on the ways in which power and prejudice intersect, from the microaggressions of a vendor to the overt abuses of law enforcement. It had also revealed the lengths to which corporations would go to protect their interests, even at the expense of truth and justice. But beyond the revelations of corruption and bias, Naomi's story had sparked conversations that couldn't be ignored. Communities across the country began asking harder questions about accountability in policing, transparency in corporate practices, and the ways in which racial bias seeped into every corner of society. Activists used her case as a rallying cry, pushing for reforms that would outlast the media cycle. Her fight had become a catalyst, proving that individual action, when supported by collective effort, could disrupt even the most entrenched systems. As Naomi closed her speech, she turned her focus to the audience, her voice steady and resolute. The fight against injustice isn't just my fight, it's ours. It's fought in every courtroom, every boardroom, every classroom, and every street corner where someone dares to stand up and say, "This isn't right." She gestured toward the crowd. Each of you has the power to create change. Whether it's calling out bias when you see it, supporting those on the front lines, or holding systems accountable, your actions matter. Progress is slow, and the challenges are many. But together, we can move mountains. Naomi took a deep breath, the applause beginning to rise again. I won't stop fighting, I hope you won't either, because the world we're building, the one where justice and equity prevail, is worth every step. As she stepped back from the podium, the audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. Naomi felt a swell of emotion, not just from the ovation, but from the recognition that her journey, while difficult, had resonated with so many. Back at her hotel that evening, Naomi sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle against the dark sky. She thought about the path ahead, the challenges that still loomed, the resistance she would inevitably face, and the people who were counting on her to keep pushing forward. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The road was long, but she wasn't walking it alone. The voices of her supporters, the courage of those who had stood beside her, and the hope she saw in the next generation, all gave her strength. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she smiled as she saw the name. It was Mitchell, no doubt with updates on the ongoing investigations into the pharmaceutical companies. She let it ring for a moment, savoring the quiet, before picking it up. Yes, Mitchell? She answered, her tone calm but ready. The fight continued, and Naomi Bennett was prepared.